Just a general overview of the proceedings. We'll open debate. We'll go into a policy round in which every senator is able to give a policy speech in which you outline your policies for the issue of the day.
Esteemed Senators, Honorable Chair, the great state of Idaho believes that it is very important that we make sure that every single person who takes genetic testing that information is kept private so that companies and the government can't just use it for whatever needs they want.
I believe that we should focus more on ensuring the accuracy of genetic testing before we employ it in our justice system.
I also believe that we should require the FDA to make a stamp or something else that signifies that the DNA test has the highest quality and will not give you false information. Moreover, we should eliminate infants and immigrants from being DNA archived.
I believe that we should test immigrants before they come into our country, genetic testing, to make sure that they are not gang members and that they're bringing in their children and not other people's children.
I believe that everyone should have equal opportunity. Therefore, I believe that we should expand GINA to stop discrimination when it comes to life and disability insurance. Thank you.
I believe that all DNA is your private information and all testing should be extremely consensual within all citizens. And all DNA used to solve federal crimes should be DNA that we already have in our systems, not newly taken DNA.
Having many different privacy policies throughout different states could be confusing for not only customers, but also companies, which would have to change their privacy policies based on states. Also, we as customers should have complete control over our data, which includes knowing where it is going and who it is being used by. This can be resolved with a privacy policy or disclosure agreement throughout the country as a whole, in which companies promise to keep our data confidential unless permitted otherwise.
I believe that genetic testing is good, but only to a limit, because we need more regulations such as GINA or using blockchain to stop leaking information from getting leaked outside to the wrong hands. Thank you.
Companies shouldn't keep the DNA information, and if they have it, they shouldn't use it. And we should only keep DNA from already convicted criminals.
I believe that the privacy and security of the people in our nations is extremely important. This data is extremely sensitive to Americans, and no one, even the federal government and forces like the police, should have access to that data without consent. I do believe, though, that DNA tests should be conducted at the border to prevent fake families from crossing.
I believe we should protect the people of America's safety by using DNA tests to catch criminals and undocumented immigrants.
Another thing that has occurred to me is the idea of secondary transfer. And if a wrong suspect has been framed for a crime, immigration, accuracy, and international misuse are all topics I want to dive into and change to create a safer environment using DNA testing.
I believe we need to shut down the companies that are supplying the Chinese government with DNA equipment that is putting Muslim minorities in labor camps. Thank you.
I believe that all immigrants at the border should be DNA tested to make sure that they are not participating in the heinous crime of child trafficking. Additionally, I believe that the FBI should be allowed to use DNA for heinous crimes such as murder and rape, of which the Golden State Killer was convicted and then tried using DNA evidence. Additionally, I believe that all citizens have a right to basic privacy and that DNA companies should be held accountable for holding DNA if they are selling it to foreign sources.
And I believe that the DNA of the people should be shared with the government, but only in the case of crime. I also believe that the DNA of people who have committed crimes, those people have no choice but to share it with the government.
Safety of American citizens should be a top priority, which is why I'm a firm believer that DNA testing should be used to solve crimes and to test immigrants at the border to detect fake families. However, I do hear everyone's valid complaints about privacy, and I would look forward to working with senators to find a solution that protects both the privacy and safety of Americans. Thank you.
For starters, GINA should be expanded because all citizens should not be discriminated by. From health insurance to life insurance to disability insurance, all of these should be covered under GINA. Additionally, we should ban federal funding for national patient identifiers because for many times, genetics and DNA are used on these patient identifiers. This is a violation of one's privacy and goes against their basic human rights.
I believe that the privacy of American citizens is very important and that DNA testing should not be shared with anybody to ensure the safety of American citizens. I do also believe that immigrants should be tested at the border to ensure that they do not have a criminal record anywhere, and also to ensure that they have a correct family relationships.
All right, so we will be accepting motions to set a specific agenda, then we'll vote on all of the agendas that have been proposed.
Motion to set the agenda to first, consumer privacy, second, use of DNA by law enforcement, and third, human trafficking.
Yes, Senator Blackburn.
Set the agenda on the topic of patient information about genetic conditions.
With that, we'll proceed to vote on an agenda.
All those in favor of agenda D, please issue placards.
All those opposed? This passes.
DNA tests are not always accurate, which is why it is very important. You must always keep them private. When one person sells their very personal DNA to a company, they're expecting that company not to just sell it to some health insurance agency so that they can use that information against them to give them less health insurance.
Suppose an inaccurate DNA company says you have a cancer gene and then of course sells it to your insurance company and they say, oh, we cannot provide insurance for you anymore because you have a cancer gene, even though it's inaccurate. That has happened many times before. And also I think that to ensure that all DNA tests are accurate, they must be approved by the FDA. Thank you.
While all the topics on the agenda today are very important to me, I'd like to discuss the latter two. DNA privacy, I'm sure we can all agree, is a basic right. People should not be subjected to having their DNA sold to foreign governments and used. Therefore, we should agree to make this bill regarding basic DNA privacy rights, and both parties should agree that it is a human right. Secondly, on the topic of human trafficking, over 700 children each year are taken from their parents in Mexico and trafficked across the border to expedite the people's lines, or to expedite the traffickers' importance in the immigration system. Therefore, this is a much less costly and much less invasive and ludicrous situation than increasing people on the border or building a border protection wall. It would only cost about $13 million, which is a fraction of the United States' $3 trillion annual budget.
Motion for a 10-minute moderated caucus, 30-second speaking time on the extent of which corporations can sell, store, and use data about their privacy.
All those in favor of a 10-minute moderated caucus with a 30-second speaking time on the topic of corporations selling data, please raise your placard. This passes.
Corporations' use of data, especially when using these data, it should be known by the people or the person whose genetics or DNA this is. They should have knowledge and they should be able to give consent when this data is used for corporation use. Thank you.
Companies cannot share or sell their consumers' data and DNA to people on the black market or the dark web. But I do believe that the government should have some sort of regulations stating that they can have access to some of this data, depending if someone in one of those consumers has committed a crime and we need their DNA.
Companies should not be allowed to sell consumers' DNA data, even if the consumers did give them consent, because I believe that most people actually don't understand what could happen if they do allow companies to sell their DNA data.
That companies should be able to give data to law enforcement, but as long as the customer has given consent, because in this situation, DNA is a very private thing, and we all need to make sure that the customer knows what it is. And like past senators have stated, they know what consent means, and they know what the company or law enforcement can do to their data.
There has been much debate about the legality of selling this information. However, the true question is not what data should be sold, but what the companies that are buying this data are actually doing with it. For example, when people consent to having their data sold on 23andMe, companies that buy this can actually use it to develop drugs that can cure lethal diseases. However, in the recent deal, for instance, between 23andMe and GlaxoSmithKline, with a $300 million deal, Consumers not only have no control over what drugs GlaxoSmithKline will be producing, but at what price they'll be producing.
At this time, we'll proceed to vote for most of these instructions. All those in favor of an 8-minute unmod, please use the flag. Clearly, this passes. You have 8 minutes. Speaking time on the topic of DNA used by law enforcement. Please use the flag. All those opposed? Passes. We'll now proceed into the moderated caucus.
Including the usage of a warrant for misdemeanors means that we are in full compliance with the Fourth Amendment, which is no unreasonable searches. This means that we can uphold our laws and societal values without needing to breach the Constitution. Therefore, we can make a more secure and stable society by using this technology and using it safely and fairly. Thank you.
That law enforcement should be able to access DNA data with a warrant no matter what, but if it is a serious crime, they should be able to access it without the consent of the consumer, because these people are a danger to our society. We need to find them and give them the justice they deserve.
They must have a warrant. If they were to search our homes or our cars, they would have a warrant. So, when they are going to be looking at our genetics or DNA, they need a warrant.
DNA should definitely be used in law enforcement. For example, on one occasion, they looked at death row inmates and were trying to see how many of them were actually deserved to be there. So they used DNA testing. In that DNA testing, they found that 13 of the 28 had actually done nothing.
Currently, we don't have this trust because we don't know what companies are doing with our data. In order to make a more productive economy, we need a bill that protects the privacy of our DNA from the government unless permitted otherwise.
But my major concern is how accurate are we looking at this? The secondary transferring. We need to make sure that the people that are looking at the DNA know what they're doing and they actually have an analysis that is reasonable.
This can easily be abused. In the case of China, they're using the Uyghur population's DNA without their consent. They're finding their DNA and they're sending them to education camps. And obviously this is not lawful and this is not okay.
China is an authoritative regime. The United States is not an authoritative regime. The law is intended to be just, and this law ensures that we can uphold the law and make sure that we deliver justice to those who have committed the most heinous of acts. The case of China is one where they're illegally using DNA testing and using it to target specific minorities. Therefore, this is not applicable to the case of the United States because we are an equal society where the law does not, where no one is above the law. Thank you.
Clearly passes. We have 5 minutes to
I agree. I think there should be a summary.
So maybe we would.
This won't happen if they're prosecuted.
Alright, shows that each refer to the other and are decided to be confusing. At least 2, maybe 3.
Just at least 2. At least 2.
And then
That should be to the website. And it needs
The
to be
website
approved.
Points or motions? 45 seconds speaking time on the topic of penalties for DNA privacy breach. Please raise your placards. This passes.
Can I speak first?
Yes.
Okay, so me and Senator Rubio and Senator Cassidy have been working on a bill called the Third Party Sales Act that has currently, as it is, I'm very open to amending this. It would outlaw sales of genetic information, and for the penalty, if they did this illegally, they could be prosecuted. The company that bought must return all the information to the company that sold, and the company that sold must give half of that to the government. The company that bought must give 10% of that money to the government, and they cannot use that the information that they got. Thank you.
I had a question about how exactly would they do that and how do you enforce them giving back the data, because obviously they can probably simply copy the data to another file.
The gist of the idea that I got from your resolution is that you wouldn't be using data collected from genetic tests, and I really do not agree with this because I think that the data should be used for scientific breakthroughs, and I think we should focus more on protecting the privacy of these users instead of just banning it completely.
Scientific breakthroughs, that's very vague, similar to all the privacy policies that I've read. So, a scientific breakthrough, what is that? Is that selling the data to their insurance provider, or is that actually doing a scientific breakthrough. I'm not sure. It doesn't sound very credible to me.
You think that there's really no need to get rid of any use of data as long as we can protect the customer and how the data is used. As long as the customer knows where the data is going and what companies it's going to be used for. And even if it is used for scientific breakthroughs like solving cancer or any genetic diseases, this can ultimately go to prove and improve human life.
Yes, it can be used for scientific breakthroughs, but is it not true that scientific breakthroughs can also be handled by the government rather than some private sector company?
But the issue with that is that it makes high expenses, bureaucracy, and the fact that it's much more difficult to collect the data and get consumers' trust from a government-regulated DNA collection service. Instead, they use something like 23andMe to harvest the data and then use private companies to actually research from there on. That would be more effective and would gain the trust of consumers. Thank you.
I believe this bill needs to have harsher repercussions because once information is out, it is very hard to make sure that that information is gone or secured. Thank you.
There should be more of a process on people giving consent to these companies, and there should be more repercussions on like what would happen if someone would have forced consent.
So we are now in debate about human trafficking.
We might not have much in common, different parties, but we have one thing in common, and that's that we're all people. And these immigrants are also people. So why should we treat them less by testing on hearts?
I know a senator before me proposed it is okay to test immigrants if they have given consent. But how do we know this is not forced consent? Now, there are many things that can cause this consent at the border by immigrants to be forced. Because one, there's a language barrier, and two, many times there is something that says that if they don't take a DNA test or a genetics test, that they could be separated from their families. Now, this is forcing consent.
The amount of people passing with children that are not their own is extremely rare. But the truth is, that's only rare based on what's currently been identified. In reality, the numbers are likely higher. Either they have just evaded capture given the inconsistency of DNA testing, or they have merely passed illegally without any border patrols noticing.
Okay, any more contributions at this time? Okay, so we're going to move into voting. So all in favor of 10 minute yeah, that clearly passes.
So our preemptory causes is that we recognize that genetic data can help solve countless crimes.
We affirm that we are affirming that the Fourth Amendment rights will not be infringed.
We acknowledge that genetic testing is not always perfect.
And we recognize that a probable cause warrant is always needed for law enforcement to access private genetic data.
And we are reminding senators that genetic testing can help save lives.
And that's our bill.
Anyone with questions?
Who do you propose will be on the committee for determining which types of crimes count as needing consent from the perpetrator?
I'm pretty sure it's already a pre-existing committee.
Thank you.
Will this bill encroach upon the Fourth Amendment rights of our citizens?
No, because a warrant based on probable cause is already needed, so it won't be unjustified.
Okay, so let's just move into voting. All in favor of an 8-minute unlimited? This motion clearly passes.
So, we'll first vote on introducing the third-party sales act. So all those in favor? All those opposed? This clearly passes.
The third-party sales act bill that was just proposed, I wanted to say, somewhere in there it mentioned getting $1 billion to allocate to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I wanted to know how this money would be found, because was it going to be taken out of taxes? Are we going to be adding more taxes to our citizens? And if it's going to be taken out of another area of the government's taxes, which area of taxes would this money be taken from? Thank you.
You said that they would get 50% of the profits turned into the government, right? But what's that other 50% going to go to? Is that going to go into their pockets from doing these business transactions?
The money will be going to a committee. We'll specialize in investigating any infractions of this bill. Thank you. The Constitution guarantees Congress the right to make taxes. The vast majority of everything Congress does comes comes from taxpayer money. Basically, whenever you ask where this money can come from the taxpayers. That's how government runs.
Senator Crapo, well, I agree with the proponent of your bill. Charging taxpayers more just because Congress needs to do something is not the best way to get money. These people are supposed to be served by us, and just charging them more is never a good solution to anything because they already work so hard to earn the money that they do.
Debate on all the bills that are on the floor, and then we will enter voting procedure.
We're going to require that DNA evidence is not the sole piece of evidence to convict someone of a crime, so that no one is wrongfully convicted through things like secondary transfer or flawed DNA tests. And then we also demand that all DNA tests that are used for data purposes are approved by the FDA.
The GINA Ethics and Excellency Expansion Act would first of all focus on non-discrimination on the basis of genetics. Aims to penalize corporations for instances of bigotry when related to genetics. Penalties range from fines to jail time in respect to the range and severity of the crimes. Bigotry will hold a legal definition in this bill as intolerance towards those who hold different opinions from oneself. The act of being prejudiced or discriminatory.
To make sure there will always be fair and safe companies, every year the FDA will check the company, and these checks will include a background check of the company, or if this is the second time they're applying for the stamp, this would mean they would look at all the previous changes they had made to the company during the previous year. And they would also review workers of the company to make sure if there's anything they're missing. The fines for this would be the same fines for bigotry, including fines and jail.
Lastly, we would have an ethics advisory panel. This panel oversees DNA testing companies, and we would have a $30 million budget in which we would give to the people on this panel. And this money will come from the Department of Homeland Security budget, which is currently $3.5 billion. We will also have consent forms, and these forms will be sent out to every DNA testing company for consent and for customers to know exactly if their DNA is shared and sold. Questions? Senator Merkley.
In your second clause, you said that stamps will expire each year to ensure the highest possible accuracy. That's great, but for the stamps, obviously, there's going to be some time where like the stamps have expired, so you need to get a new stamp that's up to date. What do you do in between? Do you stop selling your products, or like how does the company?
Applications should be sent in a few months prior to when they are expected to be returned.
Motion to open the moderated debate, total time of 8 minutes, speaking time of 45 seconds on Senator Durbin.
I wanted to elaborate on the Consumer DNA Privacy Act, and I got some questions passed to me about kind of like what's going on with that bill. So I just wanted to elaborate on the flowery language, as we mentioned, to prevent that. It'll be a government-approved policy statement that will go out to the customers so that the government can approve to make sure that the consumers will be able to understand and know what's going on, so they are giving their knowledgeable consent and know exactly where their data is going.
I just wanted to clarify that this act is solely made to reduce the amount of human traffickers and children. So we would have DNA tests to figure out if the the so-called parents are actually the children's parents.
I wanted to address the immigrant DNA testing bill that was proposed, and I wanted to just talk about how there are a small percent. I know we've mentioned how there are a small percentage of fraudulent families. There are also a small percentage of adopted, fostered, non-blood related families who are truly family. So if there is both small percents of each of these, then why do we need to test all of them and treat them so harshly and draw harsh conclusions?
I would like to express my support for Senator Durbin's ACCA Act. This act truly ensures that when we are using DNA testing in law enforcement, it is making sure that it's accurate. No one is above the law, and we should not have cases where we are misusing the law and misusing evidence and convicting innocent people. This
act makes sure that DNA testing is accurate, and that when the federal government is using it to prosecute a crime, we are not convicting the wrong people and putting them in jail for no reason.
We are now in voting procedure. We will entertain a for and against speaker for the Genetic Data Usage by Law Enforcement Act.
The government, law enforcement, cannot needlessly use data without a warrant for probable cause, and also addresses if a suspect is falsely accused and the data was gathered, the data would then be deleted, so they have no record. And if they were, if they did commit the crime, and we found them using the data would be restored because they did the crime.
Delegates and honorable chair, although I do agree with many of Mrs. Klobuchar's ideas about this bill, the one thing that I do not agree with is that minor crimes, like the person that has committed the crime has to give consent about giving their DNA to the court.
All those in favor of the bill, please raise your placards. All those in favor of genetic data usage by law enforcement. All those opposed, this clearly passes. This bill is passed. Now, we will proceed to the second bill, the Third Party Sales Act.
I really believe in this bill because it will make the testing much more clear and make it harder for people to cheat the system.
$30 million budget is simply not enough for a panel to regulate all the quality of DNA tests. That's about 300 employees that they're each getting paid $100,000 a year, excluding all other expenses, which is a ridiculously small amount. Not per salary, but for the amount of people, but for an entire department first. Analyzing the quality of tests. Thank you.
All those in favor of the GINA Act, please raise your placards. All those opposed, this passes. All those in favor of GINA, please raise your placards. All those in favor. All those opposed. This fails.
Alright, this bill, there's nothing really to complain about in this bill. It ensures what we want. We want our DNA tests to be accurate, and we don't want innocent people going to jail or even being killed because they happen to touch the same people that the murderer touched. It'd be a bit crazy not to vote for this bill. Thank you.
There's so much stuff to not hate about this bill, but there's not a lot to love about this bill either. This bill, it's not good because it's not specific, and yeah, it does what we want, but it also doesn't do what we don't want.
Please raise your placards. All those opposed, this clearly passes.
This bill is protecting customers. It's letting customers know where their data is going and what it's used for. Right now, the consent policies are just long, tiny scripts where you can't read anything. This one will make it explicitly clear. It'll tell them multiple times what their data is going to be used for and where it's going to go. This will protect customer privacy, and it'll make it so that everyone is knowing where it's going. It'll also allow people to sell their data directly to the third parties rather than the middleman, which can take away profit. It also won't allow people to do special promotions to get forced consent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Please rise.
Motion to conclude.
Yes, that is in order. All those in favor, please raise your placards. All those opposed, passes. All those in favor of closing debate. All those opposed, passes.